Welcome back, elementary educators to be. The two kinds of polygons that we really focus a lot on in our study of geometry are triangles and quadrilaterals. Why? Well, you can make any polygon out of triangles, and the simplest polygon beyond a triangle that you can make out of triangles is the quadrilateral. So these are two shapes that are foundational to the study of geometry, and you, future elementary educator, get to talk about foundational stuff. So let's talk about triangles. Triangles come in various shapes and sizes. Um, Triangles sometimes look like this. 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 Let's put some vocabulary words to things. Uh, these two triangles happen to be right triangles. Right, that's a right triangle. That's a right triangle. And we call them right triangles because their biggest angle is a right angle. It measures 90 degrees. That's coming off of a previous lesson. Uh, this right triangle happens to also have two congruent sides. This triangle also happens to have two congruent sides. And when a triangle has two congruent sides, we call that isosceles. These are both isosceles triangles. So this triangle here happens to be both isosceles and right. And you and I both know that if two sides are congruent, then two angles are also congruent. Two angles are also congruent. And so we can find out what those angle measures are, even if we don't know what those side lengths are, as long as we know that those side lengths are the same. Uh, this triangle over here, this biggest angle is bigger than 90 degrees, and so this is an obtuse triangle because its biggest angle is obtuse, and it happens to be a scalene triangle. This happens to be a scalene triangle because no sides are congruent. Now, it also happens that this one looks like it's scalene. No sides are congruent. So when a triangle has no congruent sides, we call it scalene. Generally, we classify a triangle by its sides, isosceles, scalene, or you may have heard of equilateral if all the sides are congruent. And we also classify triangles by their angles. The biggest angle is obtuse, the biggest angle is right. Here, the biggest angle is acute. So we would argue, I'm going to go orange, that this is an acute triangle because its biggest angle is acute. There it is. That's an acute angle. Okay? So triangles get classified by sides and by angles. So if I show you a picture of a triangle and I say, hey, what kind of triangle is this? Then you might do well to classify it both by its biggest angle and by the lengths of its sides. Okay? The other thing I wanted to talk about is the quadrilateral family tree. Like there are lots of kinds of quadrilaterals that we don't really study or get into because they're not interesting. But in the quadrilateral family tree, you kind of have things that look like kites and things that look like trapezoids. Now, to be clear, a kite has two sides congruent and two other sides. Two adjacent sides are congruent, two adjacent sides are congruent. It's called a kite because it's a kite. Trapezoids are quadrilaterals where at least one pair of sides are parallel. So whereas a kite has two pairs of congruent adjacent sides. Kites are classified by their sides and the lengths of their sides. Trapezoids are trapezoids because they have at least one pair of parallel sides. Well, where do things go from there? Well, you could be a special kite. That's the specialist kind of kite there is, where if not only are these congruent and those congruent, but thems are congruent. And in that case, you've got a rhombus where all the sides are congruent. Can't get much more special than that if you're a kite. Now, trapezoids break off into parallelograms if both pairs of opposite sides are parallel, right? That's this shape. Or you could be special if two of your sides are congruent. Specifically, if the non-parallel sides are congruent. That's this shape, where those two sides are congruent. Well, you can get special if you're a parallelogram. You could be a rhombus. It turns out that a rhombus is a parallelogram. So not only is a rhombus a kite, a rhombus is a parallelogram. Or you could get special in a different way. You could be a rectangle. And a rectangle is a shape with 4 right angles. And it turns out that a rectangle is a parallelogram. It just happens to have 4 right angles. Well, then we all know that if you bring rhombus and rectangle together, you get square. The square is a rhombus, all the sides are congruent, and it is a rectangle, it has 4 right angles. So you have this family tree of quadrilaterals that start with 2 very divergent ideas, and you make things more and more special until then you have something that takes every one of these ideas into account. So now you have a family tree for quadrilaterals and you have ways to classify triangles, and it's a lot of vocabulary. So hit up Bing or Google for pictures of triangles and quadrilaterals. Try to classify them so that you can do this when called upon.